Okay, right. So we're now live, aren't we? So I shall start by welcoming everyone to this online session from the Global South Forum um, um, this year in Tübingen, but also simultaneously in many other parts of the world where all our participants are joining us from. So welcome to everyone. And for a panel on education and pedagogy entitled Proximate Classrooms of the Future. The general frame in which we're talking about these issues is that of precarious futures, and I think that's something that everyone can draw some idea of relevance and immediate applicability to their own situation where they happen to be. At the same time, we're also working with a concept of proximity that we've been crafting and recrafting for 3 or 4 years now, and discovering that one can do all sorts of things with it. And many of you in the group are familiar with the sort of work we've been trying to do with this idea over the past few years. So it's my pleasure to welcome a group of speakers who are all interested in both these sorts of issues, and who are going to be presenting two papers to us today. One paper will be a single person paper, and the other paper will be a collective initiative with three speakers. So we've got four people altogether, and I think that will keep us really going well for the time we have, but will also allow us some time to discuss at the end. So let me very briefly present Danelle Chetty from the University of Pretoria, from the Department of Fine Arts, who's going to be talking about online classrooms. And then my colleagues from Tübingen, from American Studies, Astrid Franke, Johanna Röhring, and Isabel Kleiber, will be talking about their current work in classrooms in the region that we are located in here. So thank you for everyone for attending, and I'm sure, like me, you are looking forward to what we're going to hear. I'm not going to take up any more time or spoil anyone else's act, but I think we should go over to the presentations. And I think maybe it might be interesting simply to listen to both presentations and then go over to questions, which in many cases may overlap both of the presentations, and can be then taken by different people from both talks. Okay, so I think I will start with a presentation by Danelle. Would you like to start off, and then we'll move to
Sure.
the Tübingen group talking about their current work. Thanks very much. Looking forward to hearing you all.
Okay, can you see my screen and hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right, so this presentation is based on a study I conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic, where uncertainty deepened on a global scale, rendering even the near future increasingly precarious. So across global educational contexts, there was a growing anxiety about what the future might hold. And such futures might be best described as fragile futures. So, with lockdown periods frequently being extended, with no way to gauge when we may return to a sense of normality, long-term projections seemed conjectural, and as such, it seemed more fitting to engage with a near future. So, the only type of future that could be envisioned from within a precarious present. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, all contact classes ceased, and many tertiary institutions had opted to migrate all of their classrooms to online platforms since they seemed the least disruptive and the most stable of options available. Online learning, however, posed unique challenges for lecturers facilitating creative and practical based courses in fine art, music, and design. In the Information Design Division at the University of Pretoria, the predominant challenge was simulating an environment that allowed for a similar experience as contact classes. So, that is an environment that nurtures empathetic engagement and an embodied experience for students. So, in the first year imaging and visualization classes, for example, lecturers aim to show students how drawing can cultivate humanizing effects, bring about better perception, and become the locus of empathy and connection. So, the imaging and visualization module also aims to cultivate in students the ability to naturalize cognitive and strategic thinking, imagination, emotional sensitivities for aesthetics, as well as awareness around socio-cultural and humanist themes of all projects. So, in the Imaging and Visualization Guide, it states that the act of drawing in particular potentially holds the key to making visible the interconnectedness of three constituent elements of head, heart, and hand. Um, and this is since drawing inevitably, sorry, let me just fix this. Drawing even inevitably affects the way a message is conceived and perceived. Imaging and visualization is primarily a drawing-based module. An understanding of the fundamental principles of drawing as a method of inquiry, a tool for thinking, problem solving, and the visualization of ideas forms the basis for all conceptualization and problem solving processes. So, considering this, information design lecturers needed to think about how they could facilitate meaningful classes that minimized any lost learning in a time when students did not have access to studio spaces or environments that readily permitted discussions regarding the analysis and evaluation of peers' works. Lecturers were left asking, how is it possible for lecturers, or for students rather, to develop the ability to self-assess and reflect, as well as take an analytical viewpoint regarding opinions, perceptions, experiences, and contexts? So while online learning provided students with the opportunity to email lecturers at any time, discuss class content online, make use of course management systems such as ClickUp to organize instructional materials, many students had expressed concerns about how online classes had negatively impacted their learning, academic performance, stress, and motivation levels. Based on my experiences teaching online during the COVID-19 pandemic, students appeared to lack focus during online classes, and overall, the engagement was quite poor. And as a result, their learning suffered. So, when students were asked to reflect on their experiences working online, they explained that they felt that the experience was isolating, lonely, and overall, it was quite challenging and stressful. So lecturers then needed to think about how we could transition from lengthy, detached online sessions that teemed with disruptions and awkward pauses to a space that facilitated empathetic engagement and encouraged responding on the spot. So, how could we cultivate a different mental environment where the opportunity to begin nurturing a new digital humanism could begin? So while these were vital questions in the midst of the pandemic, these questions have bearing on the future with the push towards hybrid and especially online learning. So the study seeks to understand students' online learning experiences, as well as the digital applications used to facilitate online classes. Furthermore, it seeks to understand how these digital applications can be retained more humanistically by design educators to allow for empathetic engagement with themes relevant to the imaging and visualization module. So, in service of this aim, the study it has several objectives. So it seeks to explore the environment fostered in online learning spaces and gain a deeper understanding of how these platforms foster proximal distance. So within the context of education, studies tend to focus on online technologies and their democratizing qualities, their ability to widen access and allow for connection. However, a primary concern of this study is to look at ways in which recent online digital technologies have rendered a network of design students to anonymized fragments of creativity, a cloud of bits in proximal distance. So the deeper structures embedded in online technologies are epitomized by Marshall McLuhan's theorizing of electronic media, where he explains that media are an extension of the senses and that their embodiment alters mental processes and sensory balances. So in online environments, the senses are no longer animated with intentionality. They are crippled from extending an exploration of the environment and retracting within themselves in moments of reflection. So when a medium exerts its forces on us, our sensorium is provided with a stimulus that tends to bring the other senses into play into a new relation. So as tertiary institutions increasingly opt for and adopt online teaching models, design students will undoubtedly be connecting with one another via online networks in the near future. Therefore, educators must move away from methods that de-emphasize the individual student in the classroom, as this will result in generic ways of thinking. So this won't only result in unimaginative designers, but also an unconstructive and detached online space. So this brings to mind some of Jaron Lanier's insights, where he explains that the digital hive is growing at the expense of individuality. So in the case of the visual imaging and visualization module, the act of drawing itself is implicated as a result of facilitating what is essentially an embodied experience through a completely different medium, a medium that tends to create moments of friction, a habit-forming platform that forgoes the core underpinnings of the drawing practice, such as drawing for a particular context. So here, technology easily renders students into a cloud of bits. Students no longer feel the intentionality or individuality of their thoughts and actions. So this idea is illuminated by some of Maurice Merleau-Ponty's ideas, where he explains that the understanding of how the symbiotic relationship between being in the world and of the world affects all human acts. So from a design perspective, this implies that design necessitates an empathetic relationship between the designer, so the design student, and the design context. From the perspective of media theory, online technologies disembody this process of being in and of the world. Online learning technologies remove, amputate, and numb students from the ontological act of the drawing experience. So media theory points out that any medium overwhelms the message, and as such, what is individual will get ironed out. So online learning methods tend to amputate students' agency and forfeit their individuality. So this is why it becomes imperative to understand and become aware of online learning environments as a medium, to understand why it is that students adopt a passive role in these environments. So again, we explained that with these sort of environments, they amputate students' in agency and forfeit their individuality. And this is the result of computer systems that confine learning experiences to a series of pre-recorded lessons or mass online lectures. So from my experience teaching online in 2020, students' works tend to be expressed as a series of low-resolution images which lack complexity and layering. So methods that forego the generative stages of a project where ideas are conceptualized and challenged. On Jamboard, for example, we do not bear witness to the process of drawing, but only to the final outcome, which tends to present a lifeless and static perception. On Jamboard, students' works are filtered in the same way. They are filtered through the same screen and through the same sound. So the digital is devoid of a type of multiplicity and renders everything in the same way. So in many ways, the environment engendered in online spaces can be perceived as fragmented, and the experience becomes disembodied. So a process that usually involves a journey of mark making, exploration, erasures, overlays, through this back and forth dialogue between student and paper, student and environment, student and lecturer, student and peers is lost. There is a dialogical nature to drawing which is lost. So here the digital tends to be anti-phenomenological, and it reduces multifaceted, multimodal experiences to a merely cognitive plane. So here it becomes worthwhile to think about the relationship between the senses and the distribution of the sensory ratio. When we are in classroom environments, we are picking up on one another's bodily and social cues, whereas online environments seem very long and tiring and fatiguing. And this is because the cognitive domain is burdened for making up for a lack of a varied sensory engagement and interaction. Overall, perceptiveness is also deadened through digital culture. So here are some photographs prior to the pandemic where we would go outside and draw from observation.
I'm
So
sorry,
again,
but we cannot see your PowerPoint. You're not sharing a screen anymore.
let me just quickly fix that. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Um, So again, these are some examples of the photographs when students are drawing from observation prior to the pandemic. Again, there's a dialogical nature to drawing, a conversation that develops between student and environment, student and paper, as well as among the students themselves. So again, all of this multifaceted, multimodal experience is then reduced to a cognitive plane when we're working via online technologies. So see, these are some of the examples of the students' drawings when we go out and draw. So again, they're rich in perceptual detail. There is a significant amount of depth that is achieved. And we tend to get a good feel for what it is the students are drawing. Um, Again, all of this is lost though when we start to facilitate it through a completely different medium. So while the digital creates greater accessibility, it allows people to communicate and stay in contact. It also paves a great distance, so people feel alone together. So arguably during the COVID-19 pandemic, students felt more isolated and detached than ever. So the negative impacts of the COVID-19 lockdown periods still continue to show up today across several dimensions, whether it be academic, social, emotional, and physical. So many teachers, for instance, would report or do report reduced motivation and attention span. So because of the long periods spent online, this weakened students' study habits and reduced their concentration. Because of the long isolation and reduced face-to-face interaction, this led to poorer communication skills. Students can no longer resolve conflict or collaborate in the same ways. There's also more and more reports of increased anxiety and depression in classroom settings. So because of the sudden disruption during the COVID-19 pandemic, this brought about uncertainty, social isolation, which led to anxiety, depression, and emotional dysregulation. And some of this is still evident today in classroom behavior. And there's an over-reliance on technology. So because of the prolonged time spent on a screen during the COVID-19 lockdown periods, there are habits of distraction as well as instant gratification, which have led to the inability to sustain focus over long periods of time. So this presentation now turns to ways in which online learning environments can facilitate personalized dialogue to adapt students' experiences so that they feel the individuality of their thoughts and actions. My aim is to show how the phenomenology of drawing provides ample insight to better understand how online learning environments can facilitate empathetic engagement and reflective practice to personalize students' experiences. So it considers how the ontological dimension of drawing can inform online teaching models and practices. So by drawing, we inspire forms of interaction that humanize us in other people's eyes. And this raises the question of how the phenomenological act of drawing itself can humanize online spaces, specifically online learning spaces. So how can the core underpinnings of this discipline, such as empathetic engagement, authentic attunement, and perceptiveness, humanize the online space, specifically online learning spaces? How can the humanizing act of drawing serve as a hermeneutic and help educators facilitate a creative dialogue that repairs the disconnect of computer screens? So I'm going to detail some of the methods that we explored with during the COVID-19 pandemic that allowed for a more individualized experience. So similar to the ontology of drawing, these activities are dialogical and allow for reflective distance. So one of the main problems with online learning spaces and technologies is that they absorb any sense of individuality precisely because they are too immediate and do not allow for reflective distance. So firstly, students were required to reflect upon their own drawing practices and identify their strengths and weaknesses in the form of visual journaling. So a form of reflective drawing and writing. Here are some examples of the visual journal activities. So you can see that students had taken photographs or scans or thumbnail sketches of their drawings from previous projects and then identified some of the problem areas. So this could be anything from harsh mark making to bad shading habits or illogical application of light and shadow, but they were meant to reflect upon their own practice in paper-based journals. So here are some examples of those journaling activities, again, also in the form of thumbnail sketches. So the more personalized the nature of the journal, the more liberty it provided in terms of creating this internalized dialogue. So as a vehicle for reflection, the journal provided students with the opportunity to observe, document, explore, discover, question, think and critique both themselves and the world around them. So throughout this process, students found ways of reflecting on the knowledge which was inherent to their drawing process, as well as knowledge they created, critiqued, reformulated, and internalized in further action. So again, some examples of the journaling activities. And then after this, in groups of threes, students critically analyzed and evaluated their peers' work via Zoom and Jamboard. But in addition to this, they needed to make purposeful sketches in their journals where they documented, made diagrams of their peers' works as well, identifying some of the key problem areas. And then after this, they needed to think about how their own skill set and strengths could assist their peers in resolving some of their problem areas. So students created tutorial videos and instructional worksheets that were tailored towards the problem areas that they had identified in their peers' works. So here are some examples of, screenshots of the videos that they had made. So this was done in real time. Some of them even recorded their videos so that the students could refer back to it at a later stage. They made step-by-step worksheets that helped and assisted their peers with some of their problem areas. So in this case, a student was struggling with their mark making being a bit too harsh, speaking against the form. So the student looked at her own strengths. She has a sensitive mark making style. She showed the student how to go about holding the pencil, took photographs of her own drawing step by step, and then provided it to the student. So again, some screenshots from the tutorial videos that they made for one another. Some of the journaling activities where they experimented with some of the new techniques that were assigned by their peers. Exploring again with new techniques that they had developed. So in the one journal entry here, you can see the different activities she had assigned to her peers in her group to help them improve on certain techniques for this project, which looked at light and shadow relationships. And then here are just some of the results of the project. So the first drawing is from prior to this project and prior to the reflective and dialogical processes that were initiated during this project, and then the result of afterwards and after the activities they had completed. Again, there is a noticeable difference between the drawing before the project began and then after. So with the first one, you can see that there's some harsh mark making, some of the forms start to meld together, whereas with the second drawing, there's better sensitivity and atmospheric qualities. So again, the sort of dialogical process and reflective distance that mimics the act of drawing itself was able to assist in personalizing and individualizing the online working space. So by nature, any iterative process that is facilitated through interactive group discussions reveals the reflective nature of the creative process. And this process mimics the phenomenology or phenomenology of drawing itself. So in the students' daily journals, they visually recorded noteworthy conversations, experiences, thoughts, and reasoning to allow for a dialogue to develop. So again, this was documented in their journal, and as much as possible, they stuck to paper-based methods as well. All right, thank you.
Thanks very much for a really interesting way of dealing with the aporia of online teaching. Okay, so we move on from Danelle's talk to the report on the research done by Astrid and Johanna and Isabel. And I hand over to you now. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. I will begin. My name is Astrid, and then later on, Johanna will take over. We present work that was done, however, as a group of 4. So our project also involves Jasmin Blund, who can't be here today because she's busy organizing a major conference in Berlin on history in Black. And there is also, and she is with us, Isabel Kleiber, who's in the audience, and I will mention her several times. Maybe Johanna also, she is ready to certainly join the discussion later or answer questions as well. So the 4 of us initially got together because we were all involved in a series of incidents that were similar enough for us to get talking about defamatory language and defamatory practices right here in front of our doorstep in Tübingen and the neighboring villages. It's extremely proximate, so to speak. And Johanna, maybe you can go to the 5 bullet points, the 5 incidents that I could read out and then explain a bit further already in the context of an argument. Oops, I was faster than you thought, right? Sorry about that. Yeah, that's democratic etiquettes. That's how our workshop is called. And here are the 5 incidents. As I said, I will read it out and then I will explain a little bit more about this as part of an actual argument. So there is the 4th grade white elementary school teacher kicking off a unit on Indigenous Americans by coming into the classroom drumming and with war paint on her face. That was 2 years ago, March 2023. And here the expert of what happened, if you need more detail, would be Isabel. Then a year ago, actually, in October 24, on Halloween, 4 students dressed up in blackface, 2 of them in blackface, one as a KKK member and one as a concentration camp inmate, recognizable by a sort of striped suit or pajama sort of, and a Star of David. Then 3rd incident, a lengthy interview process and a controversy with the Reutlinger Generalanzeiger, a newspaper in the village or small town next door, over quote-unquote problematic words. And that was last year, and that involved me. By the way, the Halloween group was late, the controversy that ensued from that is something that Johanna especially was involved in. Then, and this is what Yasmin was involved in, the controversy over a German author, Wolfgang Köppen, and his novel Tauben im Gras, Pigeons in the Grass, as obligatory reading in schools in Baden-Württemberg in 2023, a controversial choice because that novel in a sort of stream of consciousness technique channels a lot of racist and also anti-Semitic thinking and language, as may have been typical of post-World War II Germany. The question is that fair to students in the classroom? I will explain a little bit more about that in a minute. And then finally, and that was in the summer of this year, the return of the Mohrenkönig, that is a form of blackface, in this case as a Moor, in a festivity in Wurmlingen, a festivity involving especially young men sort of competing with each other. So in our analyses, these situations arose partly through deliberate provocation, but also sometimes out of ignorance or carelessness, or as I called it in one case, perhaps thoughtlessness. There is individual ignorance, perhaps particularly in the case of the 4th grade elementary school teacher on the one hand, but then there's also clear intentional provocation on, in the case of the 4 students dressing up on Halloween, trying to provoke, of course, liberal members of Tübingen. There's also a scale from individuality, you might say, all the way to implying whole administrative bodies, as was the case in the choice of obligatory school reading, which here for us is done on the state level by groups of people who are usually not primarily trained as educators, but trained in law or in administration. And it seemed that nobody thought of the kind of situation this would create in classrooms if you confront students, and potentially also Afro-Germans or Jewish students, with anti-Semitic and racist language. And then finally, in the case of the newspaper, again, a structural and systemic question that goes all the way down to the single journalist involved, in this case, interviewing me. He was caught between his boss and myself because he was following instructions from his boss, the boss trying to also create provocation, no doubt in order to increase sales or internet presence. And I mean, what was interesting was, as the journalist with whom I was interacting got increasingly uncomfortable, he called in sick and sort of rescinded himself from the process, but nevertheless, the article was published. So these instances are somewhat challenging to classify because they can be placed on many different and sometimes intersecting scales of intentionality, as opposed to thoughtlessness, of individuality or group thinking, all the way to systemic action, and also transgression. On the other hand, they are all embedded in a climate of growing polarization and increasingly aggressive right-wing rhetoric targeting educational institutions in Germany, just as we can all see through the media coverage in the United States at the moment. So in Germany, too, campaigns against, for instance, critical race theory or postcolonial theory or gender theory, and concepts on diversity, and attacks on activists fighting for social justice. All this has begun to echo American culture wars and is meant to strategically undermine discrimination policies and thus democratic principles. And so in this climate, these incidents also lend themselves to bring up charges on racism on the one hand versus freedom of speech on the other. And the question is what this means for different types of intervention and for pushing back on these different levels that these incidents sort of bring up. The level of individual action, also of educators, but also perhaps a theoretical level of conceptualization, not as an intellectual game in the ivory tower of a university, but as an important practice that one would hope would lead to improved action, in the sense of more appropriate action, more useful, more effective action. So in this vein, we have started to, I would say, experiment a little bit with the conceptualization of teaching a form of what we call critical racial etiquette as a part of democratic education. And so in the following, I want to unpack a little bit of our terminology, and then Johanna will take this up and push this further into action as both scholars and teachers that we actually were all involved in. But she will use a specific example of that. So maybe we can go on to the next slide at this point, because again, I will read this out and then unpack the terminology that is part of that. We wanted to push back against anti-democratic habits and propaganda. We want to think of ways to educate ourselves and others with regard to democratic etiquette as a social norm, to find a form of respectful interaction as adherence to or following basic human rights. And here we particularly thought about this idea of the dignity of all human beings that is inviolable, or that should be inviolable, and that should be protected and respected. So one wide theoretical framework that we wanted to use is provided by an understanding of democracy as a form of, you could say, as a form of coexistence, actually, extending beyond politics, political institutions, the idea of the rule of law, elections every couple of years. I mean, all of those is included, but the idea of democracy as a form of, of a particular form of coexistence pushes this beyond political science into the social and into cultural spheres. Now, this is not our invention. This conceptualization has a prehistory reaching back into the Enlightenment, going all through the 19th century. As someone in American studies, I think of particularly Alexis de Tocqueville, a French thinker. And in the 20th century, I think it resonates particularly with someone like John Dewey, but also Habermas, Chantal Mouffe, Martin Saar here in Germany, and others. Now, my expertise is particularly in John Dewey, so many of the quotes and many of the thoughts I will come up with go back to Dewey. If democracy is a way of relating to each other in a particular way, what this does is it shifts our focus onto things such as customs or habits or rituals that is regulating forms of sociability, and that includes, of course, the way we talk to one another and the way we communicate with one another. So this gives significance to somewhat old-fashioned sounding terms such as tact or tactfulness, or indeed etiquette, codes of conduct, comme il faut, you name it. All these, as I said, slightly old-fashioned sounding terms. And they become important, not because tact or etiquette per se is something democratic. It isn't. I mean, there is aristocratic etiquette, for instance. There may also be an etiquette in dictatorship. But they are important when they're evoked in order to button up or buttress up or support a democracy, or when they start undermining a nominally democratic political system. Now, as a kind of side note, and this is referring to a discussion that Johanna and I had for a while, it's actually fruitful to reflect upon why etiquette and tact often sound old-fashioned, but also probably a little bit inadequate. And there is a risk that when it is brought into this context, it sounds as though we banalize what is happening, as though this is a question of mere politeness. Yeah. And I suspect partly this is because we are not used enough to thinking that social norms, because this is actually what we want to talk about, morality, social norms, is something not inside us, like the realm of authentic morality, the knowledge of good and bad that is sort of individual, but morality as something that is and ought to be something social through and through. Everything that ought or that should be is introducing normative assumptions about the social, or to quote Dewey, morals are social. The question of ought or should be is a question of better or worse in social affairs. What is good should make our life together better, freer. What we call bad, a bad choice, is when it makes our life together more problematic, when it curtails people's freedom to express themselves, when it curtails people's way to thrive and prosper. So this is not, at least for Dewey, about good and bad. It's a question of what works better for us to create a better and freer, more humane experience in which all can share and contribute. Now, in this context, that becomes important how people signal respect or deny respect. And these are often culturally specific gestures, of course. Respect is important because in both the German Constitution and also the Charter of Human Rights, this claim that human dignity is inviolable is, of course, followed by a call to respect and protect it. Achten is the German word here. But as Dewey said, this is only on paper unless it is put in force in the attitudes which human beings display to one another in all the incidents and relations of daily life, I'm sorry. So this is why we use this word respect here also, or respectful interaction. Sometimes a lack of respect might be due to a lack of knowledge, for instance, about the sacredness of days or the sacredness of objects or the sacredness of clothes that people don't know about because they don't know much about other people or other cultures. And this, I think, is probably where teachers come in and say, oh, this is precisely our turf. We can convey knowledge. But more often, it's not just knowledge in the narrow sense, but also a lack of experience in encountering and really engaging with what is perceived otherness of people and their history. And so at this point, maybe we can go over to the next slide and find a kind of, again, going back to the framework of democracy in which we want to place our form of teaching or anti-racist teaching, given the terms that I've been trying to lay out. And I think, Johanna, this is where you may want to take over.
Sure. Thanks, Astrid. Okay, so hi everybody. I come into this project from the perspective of anti-racist teachers education and also some anti-racist activism. And so we were cooperating, actually. Also, we were just helping each other out when these things happened, right? We were calling each other and sharing. And so it was a very practical form of cooperation. But like Astrid detailed, then we started thinking about some of the theoretical implications. And when Astrid was putting forth these ideas that she just explained, I initially had some discomfort with them. And I think Astrid referenced that also because to me, I felt uncomfortable, or felt a little bit anxious that if we take such sort of overarching terms or ideas, we might lose some of the specificity of the situation, or also lose sort of the extent of discrimination that was happening, or also some of the hurt that was being experienced, right? But then we started engaging with the material, and I started engaging with the material. And I was actually surprised at how well matched sort of contemporary thinking in teachers' education, or what in the German context we would call Fachdidaktik or antirassistische Fachdidaktik, is with how well it matches with some of the ideas that Astrid just put forth. So one of the quotes that really resonated with me from John Dewey is the one that you can see here, and I'm just going to read it out real quick. So democracy is the faith that the process of experience is more important than any special result attained. So that special results achieved are of ultimate value only as they are used to enrich and order the ongoing process. Since the process of experience is capable of being educative, faith in democracy is all one with faith in experience and education. And actually, Danelle, when you were talking, I was thinking about the process of experience as well. So maybe we have a connecting element there. So to me, this quote, if I think about it in terms of teaching, it really means a commitment that it means to me that democracy is a commitment to the ongoing process of experience and education rather than a focus on a single outcome, right? And this is something that I think is actually lived reality in most sort of contemporary modern classrooms already. So that, if you're teaching English, now you are not focused anymore on, do my students know the 20 grammatical skills and 500 words that are connected to the section on Australia, but where is their listening skill at? Where is their reading skill at? Where is writing comprehension at, right? So it's much more about this process of experience and process of education rather than current educational theory being about specific outcomes. So there's a real connection here to me. And of course, there's also in contemporary teaching theory, this is also closely aligned to this process of education, to my mind, this idea of the learner's self-awareness of the learner's skills, right? So that the learners are continually pushed to understand the process that they are going through so that they can act and be agents in that process, right? This is what a lot of, I think, contemporary educational theory puts forth, and especially anti-racist educational theory. So that in the teaching process there is this commitment to the process of learning rather than the specific outcome. And of course, I think if you look at teachers and the maybe the idealism of teachers, there is also a faith, right, or a trust in the idea that what Dewey calls the process of experience and education, or what teachers might frame as incorporating new knowledge, learning new skill sets, questioning knowledge, persistently challenging ideas, all of this, I think, could be subsumed under the process of education, that these skills will actually lead to an improved coexistence, right? This is, I think, a faith that if you look at what teachers report about why they are teaching and so on, that somehow there's this idea of betterment, right? And betterment leading to improved coexistence, right? So in this attempt at translating this idea into teaching reality, that was sort of the first thinking step that we went through. And then we actually had this moment where we're like, oh, and this is already present in German state curricula, right? So let me just move my slide. So if you look at both national and state frameworks in German education, democratic education and education for democracy is inscribed there already. And there is there's an explicit statement in these curricula frameworks that says in all subjects and in all extracurricular activities, democratic education must play a role. And I've got a quote here so for those of you familiar with the German educational system, this is from the Rahmenlehrplan Berlin-Brandenburg, right? So a bureaucratic document, and I've translated it. And it says democratic education in the classroom and within school culture takes place in the context of individual and shared experiences, right? So we actually, it's really funny how the overlap is. Recognition of others, and here I think we have a connection to Astrid's discussion on respect also. Belief in one's own effectiveness, so that would be participation, respect for democratic norms, rules, and laws, and a willingness to take responsibility are fundamental aspects of social and democratic action, right? And so basically what we often perceive as institutional, this sort of institutional framework that sometimes is perceived as limiting, in our case actually gives us an in to say, okay, this is what you want. Well, here you have it. Here's the democratic etiquettes. Like I said, this is our in, and we've tried to devise or really translate this into specific projects. And Isabel Kleiber is the author of one of these projects, trying to teach students and maybe also teachers about indigenous persons in a way that would, hopefully prevent also the war paint scenarios, right? The other project is the one that Yasmin Blunt and I are working on, and it's a continuation of this project, History in Black, which I encourage anybody who's involved in education in Germany to look up. It's a project which focuses on anti-racist education of teachers. So there's workshops provided to teachers and also anti-racist segments for school. And the way it's done is that they prepare material and also digitally accessible material for schools, for teachers. And I just wanted to show you this real quick, but I have to stop my Freigabe to do that. And so here we go. So if you look at, this here, you can see that we have this example of Ada Wright, they are in this case using the example of Ada Wright, an American woman who grew up as a domestic worker in the southern U.S. and became an activist and political speechwriter when actually she'd always been a writer, but when two of her sons were accused of rape, she sort of really stepped into the public eye, and she became an activist trying to get her boys out of jail. And then she actually toured through Europe. She was in Germany as well. She was imprisoned in Prague. She was invited by European socialists, by European communists to speak. You can find really interesting sources about her, encountering, Berlin socialists in 1932 or something like that. Interesting events. And so her biography really offers this multi-layered intersectional view into the 1930s and what it meant to be a Black woman in the US and Germany who was working together, these kind of things. And so what the Project History Black does is that they provide material on Ada Wright. So they provide it in so the text is written by Yasmin Blunt and Clara Wahl of the University of Marburg. All of this material is presented by Afro-German influencers on Instagram, so made digitally accessible with Black representation. And then we have material provided by the project History in Black, once again, for teachers so that they can actually work with the two source material that I just showed you, in a way which, is already where, intersectionality is part of the thinking process of how this is developed. Participation is part of it, so that, the students, it makes it easier to do anti-racist participatory education. Okay. So, in Yasmin and my work, we want to continue this exploration, and we want to sort of strengthen the American studies side, see what, because right now the focus has been on visits to Europe, and we also want to expand this for the English as a foreign language classroom. So mostly it's been used, this material is for history, and I think you can see from what I've shown you that, this didacticized school material can really work well in history classes, building these skills that I talked about before, but also can be integrated very well on sections on colonialism, but also workers' resistance in the 1920s, which is usually a very white story. You could definitely broaden that. And in English, we are thinking right now about ways to didacticize the material, use it to enhance reading competence, media literacy, and oral communication. And of course, in both subjects, English and history, the biographies can facilitate students and teachers' self-reflection on conflict and collaboration, right? So it would be a continual sort of self-investigation on how do students react to this material, what does it have to do with today, and that kind of thing. So we've sort of, we've tried to come from a big frame and tried to show you how we want to also do it in very practical projects and classroom sections. Sort of trying to focus on this process of experience, both as a way to react to these incidents, but also how to shape our teaching practice. So that's my bit. I'll stop sharing. Thanks. Thank you, everyone. You're still muted, Russ.
Sorry, the kids barged in, and so I turned off the sound for a moment. Okay, so thank you everyone for the for that extremely interesting combination of two papers that at first glance looked as though they were quite different in the sorts of things they're talking about. But as you yourselves were already beginning to do in the course of the presentation, they actually do have there are some really interesting points where they meet and converge and intersect. And I just wanted to pick up one of them myself as a way of getting the discussion going. And I think going back to I think the formulation was yours, Astrid, that democracy is a way of relating to each other and somehow perhaps repairing damage that has been done in the process of thinking about and reflecting upon and redoing sociable relating with one another. And it seems to me that Danielle, you were actually talking about the same sort of thing. Of course, the damage is coming from a different source, but how can we repair sociability? How can we, and in ways that are fundamentally sociable and communicative and intersubjective and based in the dynamics of a group. So it seemed to me this is the place where responding to different concerns and different pressures of our times. The program in both talks was actually quite similar. How do we repair classrooms might be another way of putting it. So thank you very much. That was just a question, but over to you, and perhaps now we have time for further discussion. If listeners wish to ask a question, you just put up your digital hand, and you'll have the opportunity to talk with the speakers.
Are the listeners sort of registering with the tech support, and then the tech support will tell us whether there is a question?
There's one question right now from
Oh.
Louis Obu. Do you want to take it?
Of course.
Okay, thank you very much.
Louis, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I do appreciate all the intervention, because the ideas are really eye-openers, as for especially the issue of democracy. I would like to ask a question. Democracy as etiquette of social norms. Don't you think that the fact that we are sharing some of the social norms should abide by flexibility, adaptability, and capability to how to reach the goal? So if we want democracy as etiquette as a social norm, we should not forget the issue of the necessity of being flexible and to adapt ourselves to the social norm, so that now this sharing can be effective. What do you think about that?
I think that when social norms are conceptualized as arising from practices, then the flexibility is necessarily part of it. They keep changing. This is not just this is then not just an observation that is somewhat embarrassing, but is necessarily part of this. The norms, if you believe that morality is something social and that it feeds into, ideally, into better experiences, as Johanna then tried to paraphrase again, a more widely shared experience in which more people can more easily participate, or a more humane form of interaction, then it may have to change. So absolutely, what you're saying is that flexibility or change, I would say change, is necessarily part of the conceptualization. Yes, absolutely. Does that answer your question, or have I turned things around in your mouth, so to speak?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I understood. Thank you. Thank you for your answer.
Are there any other responses to the question? Danielle, maybe?
Yeah, no, I just have thinking about democratic etiquettes, I also think about social media etiquette and the role that social media plays in some of this extreme rhetoric or forms of scandal. So often on social media, individuals transform from antagonistic observers to confrontational participants. And again, this sort of rhetoric then filters from media into the real world. So I think about this sort of violent reciprocity that happens, but this sort of either or logic as well. So there's an inflexibility that happens there. So with social media, it's an overly heated medium, so it doesn't allow for meaningful dialogue or sensitive or nuanced dialogue. So again, it's incredibly polarizing. And just going back to the idea of flexibility, I think the medium itself is inflexible, it's overheated, doesn't allow for sort of this respectful distance and conversation to occur.
Well, my 2 cents for that is that I'm always sort of inwardly bristling when it's when social media is called social media, because of course they're the products of huge corporations that try to make you addicted to them. And part of the addiction is precisely the kind of heated affectiveness, this scandalization, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so I sometimes think that if there were really social media, and if we now believe we cannot do without them, I mean, why not socialize them? Why not, fund them through our taxes, state-funded real social media, but kick out the Facebooks and kick out all these billionaires and let us truly communicate. And then let's see whether what you just described is still the case. Because I think what you describe is part of the a business model, basically, and profits
Yeah.
for people
Yes.
who really have enough money already.
Yeah. And I think that business model is built on, well, it's built on mass contagion experiments. So that's what makes social media so addictive, is that sort of a negative reciprocity, is that everything
Absolutely.
becomes heightened.
Yeah.
So again, and then that bleeds into the real world.
Yes.
So it starts off as these anonymized conversations where people can hide behind the screen. But again, it gets overly heated, and you get trapped in this mimetic craze, in the medium itself, and that filters into the real world.
Yeah.
So I agree. So you have to get rid of that sort of algorithmically tailored information that gives into your confirmation bias and makes it become more heated, makes you go into a sort of delirious hype.
Yeah. And so I see that Luis wants to jump in, but maybe just as a sort of postscript, taking up this idea of repair, because I like that, Russ, that you brought in the idea of damage repair, which I would have to think about a bit more. But I was wondering, Danelle, in your talk, whether I understood the gist of it correctly, that in some ways you said there is a bit of a success story in it, because there was all this pain and loneliness, but you found a way of dealing with it, and there was repair at the end. Would you say
It
that
was.
you
Yeah.
managed?
So I think in the
Manage
same way social media can allow for negative reciprocity or violent reciprocity,
Yeah.
because the nature of the medium is that it can enhance. I think that it can also allow for positive reciprocity, so forms of repair, forms of healing. And during that time, that was the closest we could get to it because of the
Yeah.
lack of face-to-face interaction.
I think that would be a great word for us, Johanna, Isabel, as well, wouldn't it? This idea of repairing, damage repair. I think there's,
I guess we would have to agree on when the point was when it broke. I think there might be some disagreement.
Shall we have the question from Louis?
Thank you. Just a question. The title "Alone Together," it is a sort of oxymoron. How, for example, accepting the fact that to be alone can reinforce togetherness. How this can be, knowing that we have this identity of our oneness to be alone due to COVID-19. We are conscious that we should be alone. And also we are conscious that we should share with others. So alone together can be a sort of oxymoron. How we can now, how this fact, two facts opposing to some extent, can reinforce democracy? That is my question.
So I think it's something I pointed out in the presentation with the idea of being alone together. So yes, forms of media have allowed for the global village. So it has allowed for people to stay in contact and communicate, but it hasn't necessarily allowed for meaningful connection. So I guess that's where the idea of being alone together derives from. So this idea is elaborated by an author, Sherry Turkle, and she speaks about the idea of media becoming actually more and more isolating. She specifically looks at teenagers or in classroom environments, for example, and the way in which they engage in the medium. So, via text, via social media, but how that struggles to translate in the real world, how they feel a bit more lonely in reality. So that's where the idea of alone together comes from. Um, I'm not sure how to answer the second part of the question about how it can reinforce a sense of democracy. Astrid, maybe, do you have an idea?
I want to say, knowing that there is this man, Zygmunt Bauman, who said that we are in a liquid time. Knowing that with liquid time, there are some of the social norms which are a little bit questionable in some ways. So alone and together, we should not should we just forget the fact that this can sometimes lead people to maintain their own identity or privacy, knowing that the time is not as it should be because of the environment, for example, the context of COVID-19. We know that the environment is not conducive to sound relationship with other people, but we know that we should live together. So how such a kind of idea, we can enable people to reinforce togetherness, knowing that the atmosphere is not conducive to good life because of COVID-19. That was what I was just meaning when I asked my question.
Okay. Yes, I get a sense that there's the idea of the mutual cultivation of self and things. So speaking to the sort of greater sense of relationality and our relationship with others, and then going back to what Astrid said, maybe about the sort of respectful treatment and sort of forms of coexistence. So that's what I'm getting from this, yeah.
I mean, it's also,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I was also thinking maybe this also reflects a sort of something that we were talking about when we were preparing for the talk. I mean, it's maybe this, Lewis, goes back to this term of flexibility that you brought up. I mean, this sort of I mean, if you look at the history of social media or the internet, a lot of the early pioneers were very much concerned with togetherness and democratic values. I mean, these were California hippies, right? They were, trying to share knowledge in order to empower and so on and so forth.
And there's Wikipedia as a leftover of that time to a certain extent.
For example, yeah. And so, but of course, interestingly, if you look at these early pioneers, they did not perceive the state as the saving institution. Sometimes now we say, okay, well, or Asli, you just said, well, maybe if the state took over social media, or if it were socialized or something, then it would, become less focused on this maximum engagement idea and maybe more educational again. I think the early pioneers of the internet would probably disagree quite strongly because the state, I mean, they're also coming from a more libertarian perspective, maybe.
Of course.
So, I mean, it's interesting how this, this this early internet and early ideas of sharing online really fit in with what we hear, and also Lewis and so on sort of maybe agree on being a way forward in creating togetherness. But now we've watched, of course, the total I don't know, how would you call it, commercialization and you know, this social media becoming sort of our, you know, the dominant mode of creating separation in the name of making money, something like that. So maybe it just points us to the fact that we really like this, you know, the process of experience is indeed ongoing, and we continually have to try to like come back to what it is we want and where we want to go, how are we going to create togetherness, and so on. And I mean, we, in our talk or in our discussions, if we want to do this, it seems, I'm happy that we have things like the UN Carta of Human Rights and things like that, because they seem like a basic guideline to do so, right? If we've lost track, you know, we could send these to Elon Musk or something, maybe that would improve the situation. Maybe not answering the question, but those were my thoughts to what you just said.
I think what this discussion about social media is touching on a more abstract level is really a very fundamental intellectual challenge for us, namely to figure out what is the relation of capitalism and democracy. Because historically speaking, especially when you look at the US and the UK or Britain, you know, they seem to, there is a certain synergy at a certain point in time, right? And there were times when you could think that some of the terms, even you don't even know, are they economic terms or are they political philosophy, like liberty, you know, it's an economic term, it's a political philosophical term, and it becomes one at a certain point. But what we now see is that they can actually be opponents. And the atomization and individualism was at one point something that seemed to be part of liberalism and seemed to be part of a democratic push, but actually when it pushes very far into some sort of atomization, that's the downfall of democracy, because that's where, you know, that's where fascists, dictators can rise, precisely because everyone is atomized. And so this, I think this is a challenge, and you can break that challenge down into discussing social media, for instance, or discussing what happened during the pandemic. So, yeah.
There's a raised hand also.
Oh.
Yeah, Ana Luisa.
I'm not sure if I am.
We can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, sorry. I was just wondering, by thinking about the intersection of both presentations, since one presentation proposes this togetherness through a digital world and digital educational systems, not just during the pandemic, but this is also a consequences of a post-pandemic world. And creating an intersection of this necessity to bring up this new literacy to this digital world, when we know that the necessity to integrate through social media or the digital means of gregariousness, we somehow lost our ability and I really like the use of the wording etiquette, because we somehow have, on the digital world, we navigate through a world where we have lost manners and social skills, because it seems like this digital world is governed by a different kind of etiquette where there's no beginning or end to conversations. and no need to evoke, let's say, the social norms that apply in real life, let's say, or let's say in a presential life. So since this media or this digital world is disrupting not just the democratic orders, but also our etiquette, our literacy in all levels of education, let's say. I was trying to elaborate how can we create this intersection between these worlds, digital world, and how can it become aligned with democratic values? Thank you.
So I invite the speakers to make a concise response to this highly complex and multi-layered question.
I feel a bit helpless because even though, you know, etiquette, manners, I really like that in the question, but I'm not really, I don't feel I'm such an expert on, you know, on social media and what the I mean, I'm a very skeptical person with regard to the technology, and I feel that from what I saw from your talk, Danelle, I was really impressed by coming up with the ideas that you introduced to us of under the worst of conditions, you could make something like cooperation and collaboration work, even on a distance. And I mean, I'm all in awe of that. So I guess you would be a better person maybe than I am to sort of speculate or be creative about what can be done.
I think at the heart of it, it's empathetic engagement. So when I think about the sort of talks around etiquette and manners and how does people conduct themselves in specific spaces, what is the norm? I don't think there's a rigid or invariable idea of what that is, but I think approaching things with empathy. And that's something that was important with my study was how can we nurture a sense of empathetic engagement with students when there is no face-to-face interaction, when they aren't seeing each other in a normal classroom setting. Again, one of the core underpinnings of the drawing practice is developing this sort of empathetic engagement. And if I think about social media as well, when I think about the ways in which people interact with one another in this space, there tends to be a lack of empathy.
Can we put in a large dose of massive user-centered state regulation, and then I'm on board.
I like the idea of user-centered regulation, and maybe that's a very nice way, actually, a very nice sort of slogan to wind up. I'd like to thank you all for really fascinating papers that touched on dozens and dozens of extremely critical points in our contemporary moment, while both being very, very specific and linked to specific cases, specific events, specific problems. And thank you to the listeners with some very acute and perceptive questions that allowed us to continue that discussion on different axes. So thank you, everyone. It's been a very productive session, and I'm really looking forward to hearing where these projects go. And of course, as we've discussed before, we would like to make some sort of a platform to make these contributions public, and I'll be talking with everyone about this at some later point. So for those of you who are in the dark northern hemisphere where the lights have already gone off or on, depending on your point of view. Good night for those of you who are elsewhere in the world where it's a different time of the day, either good morning or good afternoon. And we look forward to having you in the subsequent sessions in the forum over the next 10 days or so. So everyone, thank you very much again, and take care, and we'll see you online or in presence in the coming days. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.